The scars of World War II were still fresh when American F-86 Sabres and Soviet-made MiG-15s were cutting across the skies of Korea. They scratched the speed of sound and turned the region into the world's first great jet battlefield. America believed advanced technology would take on the victory. The Soviets trusted that rugged, heavy hitters could win any battle through brute force alone. Now, it was time to discover who was right. The propeller-based aircraft the U.S. Air Force had fought during the previous war rarely exceeded 480 miles per hour. But as Americans spotted their new adversaries on the horizon, they could see them approaching at speeds nearing 700 miles per hour. These Soviet warriors were pouring across the border with China by the dozens, flying south before the Americans could even get their bomb bays ready to strike their targets. From the cockpit of his F-86, Major George Andrew Davis Jr. knew he and his 8-aircraft formation had the best chance to take out these attackers. And so, without thinking twice, he pushed the throttle and his jet darted ahead. As the enemy came into view, Davis got his Browning M3 machine guns ready and unleashed a stream of 12 7mm bullets. The weapon spat fire so fast it was almost impossible to see the shells emerging from the barrels, each delivering over 1,200 rounds a minute. However, taking out the Soviet jets wouldn't be easy, because even when they were hit, the American guns proved too light to effectively shred through their fuselages. Some MiGs banked hard and darted in the opposite direction, crossing the Yalu River into China before the Americans could land their definitive blow. Others, however, were not intimidated and opted to fight back. Closing the distance, the Soviets brought their own weapons to bear. Their Nudelman Suranov NS-23 and Nudelman N-37 cannons couldn't match half of the Americans' guns' rate of fire. Still, boasting calibers between 23 and 37 millimeters, if their fire were to find the U.S. jets, Davis knew he'd be in trouble. He banked his aircraft hard, rolling into just the right position to pound the fuselage of one of his targets as hard as his guns would allow. The Soviet jet didn't break apart, yet the damage was still considerable, and the pilot had no option but to eject. One enemy down, the American major wasted no time. He turned around, unleashing another barrage of fire against a second MiG-15, giving it little chance to fight back, before the airman inside was bailing out as well. That day, Davis's pack reclaimed 4 Soviet fighters. However, the battle between American and Soviet jets was only getting started. Many pilots, including Major Davis, would become aces aboard the North American F-86 Sabre. However, over Korea, not even the most advanced jets in the U.S. arsenal could keep airmen safe forever. During a patrol over the so-called MiG Alley in the northwestern section of North Korea, where most battles against Soviet aircraft took place, he spotted a dozen Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-15s and dived down for a direct attack. His fire quickly struck one of his targets, bringing it down in the blink of an eye. Before the formation could react, he was already turning his cannons toward yet another fuselage. Another enemy fell. Davis was on a roll. But the Soviets were fast, and before the major noticed, one of them was already on his tail. He didn't have enough time to swerve out of the way before a shell struck his aircraft. There was nothing his teammates could do but watch Davis's Sabre come crashing down. The Korean War would end the following year, but after enduring hundreds of losses like this, neither America nor the Soviet Union was ready to let their fighters rest. Both nations knew that the next time their aircraft faced each other on the battlefield, they couldn't afford to fall short. To win the skies, pilots needed even faster jets, capable of tearing through the sound barrier and delivering a much more devastating punch. Guns and cannons wouldn't be enough. These new jet fighters would also have to carry some of the most devastating bombs each nation could develop, and drop them into the heart of enemy positions if a mission called for it. The Soviets began working on their model around the same time the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed in the summer of 1953. This time, it was decided that development would be led by the recently reopened Sukhoi Design Bureau. It had been a couple of years since the company had produced an aircraft, and despite prior experience with jets, its engineers had never assembled a fully operational supersonic combat aircraft. Still, Sukhoi's designs, while unproven, excelled in rugged, high-speed performance, suited to brutal frontline contact, exactly what the USSR needed. Meanwhile, America seemed to have an easier path ahead. By the time Sukhoi designers were just starting work on their latest aircraft, the North American F-100 Super Sabre, the latest evolution of the feared F-86 Sabre, was already taking off. Unlike its predecessor, whose top speed capped out at just over 687 miles per hour, the F-100 could exceed 900 miles per hour, making it the first operational American aircraft capable of supersonic speed in level flight. Now, all U.S. engineers needed was to make some final adjustments and a couple of upgrades, and soon these jets would become the sort of fighters no Soviet aircraft could ever bring down. On September 10, 1956, test pilot Bob Baker would be the first to take off aboard America's new jet from Edwards Air Force Base in California. The model was envisioned as a fighter-bomber variant of the F-100, and it was initially referred to as the F-100B. However, in the end, the aircraft was given a new designation altogether, and the moment Baker laid eyes on it, he understood exactly why. There were still similarities between this jet and its predecessor. Both had swept wings, long, narrow fuselages, and pointed noses. However, changes to the original design had piled up, delivering a jet so different from the original F-100 that the only way to refer to it was by a different name, the F-107. The first thing Baker noticed was that to make space for the nuclear payloads the jet would be tasked with carrying, the classic nose intake configuration of the Super Sabre was gone, replaced by a giant dorsal intake above the fuselage, just behind the cockpit. Because of this modification, Baker couldn't even slide the canopy open to enter the cockpit, as one would with a traditional jet, instead having to open it vertically to avoid bumping into the intake. Once inside the F-107, the pilot's skepticism didn't let up, as he immediately realized the intake posed yet another problem. His rear visibility had been considerably reduced. Still, he knew better than to voice his concerns. The current position of the Air Force was that in upcoming battles, pilots wouldn't need to have a full view of the skies around them. During bombing runs, F-107 crews would only need to keep their sights set on the target ahead and rely on radar systems to track potential threats. In fights, there wouldn't even be a chance to see the enemy coming, as missiles would start flying long before pilots made visual contact with their rivals. And so, Baker rolled the jet across the runway. The jet's Pratt & Whitney YJ-75 P9 turbojet purred as the pilot checked the panel ahead of him one final time to ensure all systems were in order before takeoff. This powerhouse could deliver roughly 50% more thrust than the Super Sabre's engine, potentially giving enough push to reach twice the speed of sound. Still, no one could guarantee that once airborne, the jet would be able to control this energy.
118, cleared for takeoff.
Nevertheless, Baker pushed the throttle, and the F-107 darted ahead. In a flash, the jet was already thousands of feet above the ground, nearing its 53,000-foot service ceiling in just a couple of minutes. As the jet continued darting ahead, the test pilot could see the airspeed gauge climbing. 400 miles per hour, 500 miles per hour, 600. The controls seemed steady. The jet was holding firm. 700 miles per hour. The jet was entering supersonic territory on its very first try, and while engineers had designed the F-107 to go even further than this, it was not a bad start for the aircraft. However, the moment the jet settled at around Mach 1.03, a grim idea suddenly crossed Baker's mind. Engineers had ensured the F-107 was equipped with an ejection seat in case anything went wrong. However, going so fast and pushing the engine closer to its limit, what guaranteed that the moment a pilot ejected from the cockpit, he wouldn't be swallowed by the massive intake positioned right behind him? This would soon become a fear among many crew members, earning the aircraft the nickname the Man-Eater. However, on its very first flight, Baker had no time to worry about being swallowed by his own jet. All he could do was hope that the systems wouldn't betray him. After about 40 minutes of stable flight, Baker was finally ordered to return to base. The pilot brought the jet back to the runway without issue, the wheels touching down as he engaged braking procedures. Everything appeared to be working as planned, but something was not right. The brake chute, which would help the jet come to a standstill, did not deploy, and as the F-107 approached the end of the runway, its speed remained too high. Baker tried to pull on the brakes as hard as he could, yet the aircraft kept rolling, racing past the asphalt and darting ahead until it fell into a ditch. The Americans still had some work to do, and they'd better do it fast before their Soviet rival took the lead. About 5 months before American test pilot Bob Baker took off aboard the F-107, engineers at Sukhoi on the other side of the world seemed to be gaining the advantage. The first prototype of their new jet, which would soon be known as the Su-7, had taken off, powered by the new Lyulka AL-7 turbojet engine. This powerhouse couldn't produce as much thrust as the F-107, but still, as the Su-7 climbed ahead, it proved capable of reaching speeds of Mach 2.04. Few American jets could match this velocity. Even the experimental Lockheed XF-104 Starfighter, considered one of the fastest U.S. aircraft of the time, had a reported maximum speed of around Mach 0.18. When Western officials witnessed this first prototype of the Su-7 cutting across the skies above Moscow during the annual Soviet Aviation Day display in the summer of 1956, they became concerned that if American engineers didn't pick up the pace with the F-107, the USSR could soon wield the most fearsome fighter ever deployed. However, behind the Iron Curtain, Sukhoi hid the fact that despite the promising first flights of the Su-7, the road ahead was turbulent. To start, the original design was conceived strictly as a low-level fighter and lacked the necessary equipment to carry bombs across the battlefield. Engineers planned to make up for this by mounting the jet with the same Noodleman N-37 cannons that had proven so effective against F-86 Sabres in Korea, as well as a set of 57mm rockets, which, although lacking targeting capabilities, promised to bring down American jets with a single hit. The problem was that, although this concept had potential, Soviet officials weren't sure the fighter could live up to the lightweight design of Mikoyan and Grievich, which had already proven themselves numerous times across the battlefield. Their newest model, the MiG-21, which was still in development, was already looking like a better fighter option for the country than the Su-7, given its excellent climb rates, extremely efficient maneuverability at high speeds, and ability to carry a wider selection of air-to-air missiles. Still, Sukhoi couldn't give up just like that, not when its engineers had come up with such a promising prototype. And so, on November 23, 1956, a little under 2 weeks before the Americans had first flown their F-107, Soviet test pilot Ion Sokolov climbed into the cockpit of the Su-7 and took off, ready to show the Soviet leadership that this was the jet they'd been looking for. Despite its high acceleration, the Su-7 was known for requiring long runways for takeoff and landing, so Sokolov had to roll back as far as possible before activating the afterburners and shooting forward. Once the jet had lifted off, climbing should have been easy, with the aircraft capable of reaching climb rates of well over 20,000 feet per minute. However, as Sokolov guided the Su-7 prototype, the engine didn't seem to be working with him. This was known to be one of the jet's main problems. At times, the aircraft could exceed twice the speed of sound. At others, it refused to obey pilots as they pushed throttles forward. In some particularly bad moments, it even seemed unable to keep itself airborne. And that is exactly what was happening during Sokolov's flight. Details about what happened next remain scarce even to this day. Perhaps, realizing that the aircraft wasn't performing as it should, the test pilot attempted to bring it down as quickly as he could. Or maybe he kept climbing, pushing the engine until it finally gave out. Whatever the case, the Su-7 came crashing down, destroying the program's first prototype and taking out Sokolov in the process. Soviet engineers attempted to salvage their design by modifying the engine, but while this did secure the company a limited production run, it was ultimately determined that the Su-7 as a fighter wasn't working. Still, Sukhoi would have one more chance to beat the Americans. If the Su-7 fighter variant was going to be upstaged by the MiG-21, then the company had to offer the USSR a new design, a creation that served as a direct rival to the F-107, explicitly envisioned as a fighter bomber. And its name would be the Su-7B. By the end of the 1950s, both America and the Soviet Union believed they'd finally found the aircraft that would take them into the future of aerial warfare. After some adjustments and airspeed testing, the F-107, now unofficially known as the Ultra Sabre, had become one of the most advanced and ambitious aircraft America had assembled up to that point. As for the Soviets, their final version of the Su-7B may not have been as refined as the American jet. Still, it was nothing to be scoffed at. A brutal, heavy strike aircraft designed for one specific purpose: to survive long enough on the battlefield to hit back harder. However, the question remained: which jet would become the leading Cold War aircraft? When it came to speed, the F-107 took the lead, able to reach Mach 2 while maintaining impressive handling, thanks to its swept-wing design. Still, the Su-7B didn't fall too far behind. While modifications to the engine to ensure reliability meant that the jet couldn't go as fast as the earlier prototypes, it could still reach a very respectable velocity of Mach 1.74, or roughly 1,340 miles per hour. The Soviets also armed the Su-7B with heftier guns, capable of tearing apart the fuselages of bombers and fighters alike in a single pass. And while the F-107 had a superior payload capacity, the Soviet jet's bombing abilities were still impressive. Footage of Cold War tests conducted aboard an Su-7B seemingly showcases one of these units carrying out a rare, low-level nuclear bomb deployment with seemingly no trouble at all. A pilot is even seen performing a complex over-the-shoulder toss maneuver, driving his aircraft up a steep incline before launching the bomb, performing a half roll, and then flying fast in the opposite direction before the explosion. During this particular test, the Soviet jet was said to drop a 244N bomb, which, depending on the variant, could be as powerful as 30 kilotons, or about twice as powerful as the nuclear payload dropped over Hiroshima. However, there was one aspect in which the F-107 clearly surpassed the Su-7B, and that was handling. The Americans had packed their jet with cutting-edge systems that allowed for more stable flight and a maximum range of nearly 2,500 miles. Meanwhile, the Su-7B, designed to hit fast and hard, burned fuel so quickly that at times crews had to install additional tanks where rockets ought to be, just to ensure it remained airborne during missions. And even then, it was rare for it to reach 1,000 miles. Still, the Su-7B made up for it with easy maintenance and the ability to take plenty of damage without giving up. The jet could head out to battle, be hit by dozens of American rounds, come back for quick repairs, and return to the skies in no time. Wielding these two very different fighter bombers, any nation could claim victory. However, before American and Soviet jets could have their definitive rematch after Korea, they would first need to win the fight back home. No one in the US could argue that engineers at North American hadn't come up with something truly special with the F-107. However, the jet wasn't the only design the American Air Force was evaluating, and riddled with Cold War-era paranoia, officials were skeptical about investing in any aircraft that couldn't guarantee to keep the Soviet nuclear menace at bay. The Ultra Sabre was fast, in fact one of the fastest designs in the US arsenal, and it could carry nuclear payloads powerful enough to serve as a viable deterrent. And yet, there were other aircraft that could deliver an even bigger strike. The main rival for the F-107 was the F-105 Thunderchief, designed by Republic Aviation. This jet couldn't climb as fast or reach the heights the Ultra Sabre could. It was also bigger, giving enemy pilots a wider target to shoot down. However, while the F-107 could carry only 10,000 pounds of ordnance, the F-105 design included an internal weapons bag capable of carrying up to 14,000 pounds of payload. Enough to carry America's mighty B-43 nuclear weapon, capable of delivering an explosion of up to 1 megaton, about 70 times more powerful than the bombs that fell over Japan. Now, American officials had a tough decision to make. They could go with the aircraft that seemed the better fighter, or the one that would deliver the hardest punch. If this debate had arrived 10 years earlier, when American and Soviet jets were fighting tooth and nail over the skies of Korea on a daily basis, the answer would have been obvious. But now, with fears that during the next war, Soviet jets like the Su-7B could simply evade American defenses before dropping nuclear bombs over NATO positions, the nation couldn't take any chances. They needed an aircraft that could eliminate its enemies the fastest. Some also suggested that political factors were at play. At the time, Republic Aviation had few contracts, while North American was working on a wide array of defense aircraft. And so, unwilling to risk losing one of its most important aerospace designers when the nation needed it most, officials may have opted to go with the F-105 to keep Republic afloat. Whatever the final reasoning, the decision had been made. The F-107, with only 3 prototypes ever completed, would end its run before it could ever face its Soviet rival. The F-105 Thunderchief would get a chance to prove it was worthy of taking the spot that was meant for the F-107 during the next great clash between American and Soviet-designed aircraft. This time, the battle would take pilots to the skies over Vietnam, where once again, Soviet-backed communist forces threatened to take control of the entire nation. The Air Force was clearly confident in the F-105, and it would go on to fly more than 20,000 sorties. However, officials quickly realized that this was not the sort of war one could win with heavy bombs alone. On the ground, the enemy spread across concealed strongholds throughout the jungle, and strategic targets were often guarded by surface-to-air missile stations that pilots couldn't see until it was too late. In the skies, the situation wasn't much better, as pilots faced fast, agile MiG fighters that even America's most capable airmen had a hard time catching up with. Nearly 400 F-105s would be plucked out of the skies, roughly half the total number of Thunderchiefs ever built. Due to these catastrophic losses, the jet would eventually be pulled back from Vietnam, leading some to believe that America had made a mistake by dismissing the F-107 before it had a proper chance to prove itself in battle. Some analysts speculate that the Ultra Sabre, with its smaller frame and rapid acceleration, could have flown circles around the Soviet jets over Vietnam, sparing the lives of hundreds of American airmen, and potentially giving the nation an edge in the war early on. Whether this would have been the case will never be known, as the F-107 project was never revived, leaving the path wide open for its rival, the Su-7, to take center stage. While Americans struggled in Vietnam, the Su-7 became the aircraft the F-107 never could. With nearly 1,900 units built, the jet turned into one of the leading Soviet fighter bombers in the years that followed, and despite its apparent simplicity and somewhat limited capabilities, it proved itself across multiple battlefronts in Egypt, Syria, and Pakistan, on some occasions even by going up against other Soviet-designed jets. During the 1971 Indo-Pakistan War, Indian Air Force Flight Lieutenant Surinder Singh Malhotra, flying aboard an Su-7, was sent to carry out a reconnaissance mission over a Pakistani airfield when he suddenly noticed 2 enemy Chinese-built MiG-19s flying in front of him. At least one of them had already spotted him, and the pilot inside was already turning back to face him. Malhotra could turn back and flee, but he trusted that his jet could keep him safe. And so he pushed ahead, maneuvering the tough controls of the aircraft with enough expertise to place it in just the right position to strike. By the time the incoming enemy was within range, the Su-7 was already firing. The MiG-19 fell to the ground, engulfed in smoke, as Malhotra turned back, flying his jet safely back to base without trouble. If only the fights against MiGs over Vietnam could have been this easy for the Americans, then perhaps the end of the war would have been different. But as the US withdrew from the country, and Vietnam was eventually taken by the communists, many were left wondering if the nation had made a miscalculation. Perhaps what America needed all along was a metal brute, like the Su-7.